A little girl in pajamas walks up to a royal prince, says something unheard of, and his reaction is something no one could have predicted. What happens next will leave you speechless. Stay with me until the end, and you'll see why this moment is like nothing you've ever seen before. Before we dive into this moving story, take a moment to comment below where you're watching from today. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that will stay with you long after they're told. The morning fog clung to the cobblestone streets like an old secret, shrouding the grandeur of Windsor Castle in a blanket of mystery. The stone towers loomed high above, their ancient faces etched with history, while the sharp outlines of the palace battlements pierced the soft grey sky. The castle, a symbol of royalty and tradition, stood still in the early hours of dawn, like a giant waking from a deep slumber. Only the faint sounds of a distant carriage and the rustle of wind through the trees broke the silence, as if even nature was holding its breath. In the heart of the courtyard, Mike Edward, young, poised, and accustomed to the discipline of royal life, stood like a figure carved from stone. His uniform, meticulously pressed, gleamed in the soft light of the morning, his sword by his side reflecting the faint glint of the first sunlight. His gaze swept across the landscape, sharp and watchful, though the royal routine had begun to feel almost repetitive. There was no excitement in his life anymore, just the strict codes and rituals that had been passed down through generations of the royal family. Everything had a place. Everything had a purpose. His world was one of order, carefully constructed, unwavering, and predictable. But as the mist began to lift and the morning light spilled over the ancient stonework of the castle, something stirred in the distance, something so out of place, so unexpected, it stopped Mike Edward in his tracks. It was a small figure, barely visible at first, but as it emerged from the mist, it became clear. A little girl, no older than 7 or 8, was making her way toward the castle gates. Her footsteps were quiet but deliberate, each one bringing her closer to the imposing figure of the prince. She was dressed in wrinkled, faded green pajamas, soft cotton that had seen better days, and her tiny bare feet padded against the cold cobblestones. The contrast between her innocent, disheveled appearance and the rigid, polished world of the royal palace was impossible to ignore. Her dark curls bounced with every step she took, and her eyes, wide and full of something that seemed both innocent and wise beyond her years, locked onto the prince as she approached. There was something deeply unsettling about the girl, a quiet determination that seemed out of place for someone so young. She was unafraid, as if she had no understanding of the boundaries that separated her from the royal world. She walked toward the prince with a sense of purpose that made no sense, considering her age, her attire, and the fact that she was standing in the heart of a place few were ever granted access to. Mike Edward's mind raced, trying to piece together why she was here, what had brought her to this fortress of tradition and ceremony. But before he could process the situation, the little girl stopped just a few paces in front of him. She didn't bow or curtsy. She didn't even acknowledge the royal guard standing nearby. She simply stood there looking up at him with those wide, searching eyes. And then, without a hint of hesitation, she spoke, her voice soft yet filled with a quiet resolve, as though she knew exactly what she was doing. "Are you a hero?" Mike Edward blinked, the question catching him completely off guard. "Are you a hero?" The words echoed in his mind, each syllable reverberating against the walls of his structured world. He had spent his life surrounded by the finest tutors, the sharpest minds, and the most rigid protocols. He was the epitome of royal discipline, always upright, always vigilant. Yet, here stood a small girl, no older than 7 or 8, her gaze steady and her voice unwavering, asking him a question that seemed both absurd and deeply meaningful at the same time. For a moment, the world around him seemed to pause. The low hum of the castle's waking morning, the steady clinking of armor from the nearby guards, all faded into the background as Mike Edward processed the simple, unexpected question. He looked down at the girl in front of him, her pajama-clad form standing in stark contrast to the grandeur of the royal estate. Her wide eyes, dark and full of something he couldn't quite place, met his. There was a vulnerability there, but also a quiet strength, a mix of fear and determination that told him this was no ordinary child. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The question seemed so foreign to him. A hero. In the world he inhabited, there were no such things as heroes. There were only duties to uphold, rules to follow, and a kingdom to protect. He was a prince, a symbol of power and tradition, not someone who played the part of a hero in a child's imagination. But as he looked at her again, his gaze softened. The girl's face was framed by a tangle of dark curls, her cheeks still slightly flushed from the morning chill. She held her ground, her small hands clutching a ragged stuffed animal, its fur worn and frayed. There was a quiet plea in her eyes, a silent cry for something far beyond the surface of her simple question. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "What do you mean?" His voice sounded strangely distant, even to his own ears, as if the formalities of his royal upbringing were being pushed aside in that instant. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, the little girl took a cautious step closer, her tiny feet making no sound against the cobblestones. She looked up at him, the words seemingly tumbling out with no filter. "I need help," she whispered, almost too softly for him to hear. He leaned in slightly, his curiosity piqued, though every instinct told him he should remain steadfast and unyielding. It wasn't his job to interact with strangers, especially not children from outside the royal circles. He was a guard, a protector of the castle. His duty was to remain vigilant, to ensure the security of the kingdom, not to engage in the personal matters of those who wandered too close. But this was different. The desperation in her voice, the uncertainty in her small frame. It struck a chord deep within him, one he hadn't realized was so fragile. Before he could speak again, the girl continued, her words growing more urgent.
"My brother's in trouble," she said, looking over her shoulder as though checking for someone. "I need someone who can help him. They won't listen to me."
Mike Edwards' heart skipped a beat. He could see her trembling now, the weight of whatever she was carrying pressing down on her small shoulders. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. A young girl in the middle of the royal grounds, wearing nothing but pajamas and carrying a stuffed animal, seeking help for a brother he could not see, and for a problem he had no knowledge of. The guards who flanked him, stoic and unmoving, were clearly unaware of the girl's distress, their eyes trained forward, focused on their own duties. It was as though they were oblivious to the emotional turmoil unfolding just a few feet away. Mike Edward took a breath, his gaze still fixed on the girl. There was a part of him that felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility for her, something far beyond the rigid expectations of his role. "Where is he?" he finally asked, his voice soft, betraying a hint of concern he hadn't meant to reveal. The question lingered in the air, the weight of it pulling at him as if calling him to action. She hesitated, her gaze flickering down to her stuffed animal, and for a fleeting moment, Mike Edward saw the smallest spark of fear flicker in her eyes. Not just for her brother, but for herself. Behind the walls, she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder.
I don't know who else to ask. I thought maybe you'd help. You look like you could."
Her words struck him like a bolt. She wasn't just asking for help in the way a child might. There was something about the way she spoke that made it feel like this was her only option, like she had no one else to turn to. The request was simple, yet the implications were far deeper than he could have ever anticipated. Mike Edwards stood still, torn between his duty and his growing concern for this child he barely knew. He had always believed that his role as royal prince and protector was clear, that his actions were bound by tradition, by the expectations of his family, and by the rules of the kingdom. But now, standing in front of this small, vulnerable girl, all of that seemed so distant, so irrelevant. His mind raced. He should escort her to the proper authorities, perhaps, or have one of the other guards take her somewhere safe. But that would mean breaking protocol, stepping away from his post, and defying the very duties he had sworn to uphold. For the first time in his life, Mike Edward was faced with a decision that couldn't be solved with the same careful precision that he had learned his whole life. He wasn't sure what to do, but he couldn't turn his back on her. Not after what she had just revealed. "Show me," he said finally, his voice firm, though the uncertainty lingered in his chest. "Take me to him." And just like that, without hesitation, the little girl nodded, her face lighting up with a mixture of hope and relief. As she turned to lead him, her tiny hand reaching out to guide him, Mike Edward couldn't help but feel that this moment, this encounter, was about to change everything. Mike Edward's boots echoed softly against the cobblestones as he followed the little girl through the gates, his gaze fixed on her as she led the way with an almost unnerving confidence. Her small form was a stark contrast against the grand backdrop of Windsor Castle, and the deep quiet of the palace grounds only amplified the strange sense of tension in the air. She seemed so small, so fragile, but at the same time there was a quiet strength about her, something he couldn't quite place. It unsettled him. As they walked, the prince couldn't help but notice how out of place the girl looked. Her green pajamas, now even more wrinkled from the journey, trailed behind her like a flag of vulnerability. The contrast between her disheveled appearance and the pristine environment of the castle was jarring. The ancient stone walls that surrounded them, the formal guards who stood unmoving at their posts. Everything about this place screamed order, precision, and discipline, and yet here she was, so carefree, so unaware of the weight that his world carried. Mike Edward's steps slowed as he observed her with increasing curiosity. The little girl seemed to glide, almost floating between the cold, unyielding stones, her bare feet making no sound against the ground.
She moved with a sense of urgency, but there was an innocence about her, a childlike freedom that he hadn't seen in years. He realized with some surprise that she wasn't just walking, she was trusting him.
Trusting him to follow her, to guide her to whatever it was she needed. There was no hesitation in her movements, no second guessing. She had made up her mind, and she was determined to see it through.
As they neared the courtyard, the girl suddenly stopped and looked up at him, her wide eyes meeting his with a question that seemed almost too big for someone her age.
She fidgeted with the hem of her pajamas, then, without a word, reached into the pocket of her worn-out night clothes and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. She held it out to him without a word, her hand trembling slightly, as though unsure whether he would take it. Mike Edward glanced down at the paper, perplexed. Without thinking, he extended his hand and took it from her. The paper was soft, the edges frayed, as though it had been carried around for a long time. When he unfolded it, he saw a small, hastily scrawled note, barely legible, its words clearly written in a hurry. "Please, save him. He's the only family I have left." The prince's heart skipped a beat. The note was simple, yet it felt like a heavy weight pressing against his chest. Who was this child? Who was the him she referred to? The words seemed to carry an unspoken plea, a cry for help that cut through the prince's layers of duty and protocol. He looked down at her, searching her face for some clue, some explanation. Her expression was solemn now, her eyes fixed on the note in his hand, her small fingers still gripping the edge of her teddy bear, its faded fur almost completely worn through. It was the only thing that seemed to anchor her in this strange, quiet world. "What's this?" Mike Edward asked gently, though the words felt clumsy in his mouth.
Who are you trying to save?
The girl's lips trembled slightly, and for a moment she looked as though she might retreat into herself, as though the weight of the question had become too much for her to bear. But then, with a deep breath, she lifted her chin and said in a small but resolute voice, "My brother." "My brother," she repeated, as if it were a sacred promise. "He's all I have left. He's in trouble. They won't listen to me." Mike Edward felt his chest tighten at her words. Her brother, he thought. How much had this little girl endured? What had she already been through to find herself standing before him, of all people, asking for help?
She wasn't just asking for a favor. She was putting all her trust in him.
For a moment, he felt paralyzed by her simple plea. He was a prince, trained from childhood to follow orders, to protect the kingdom. But this was something different. The rigid structure of his life had always made sense. Protect the castle, protect the crown, protect the royal family. But now, standing in front of this earl, those rules seemed distant. Her words echoed in his mind, the weight of them sinking deeper with every passing second. The prince hesitated. His entire life had been one of duty, one of standing firm and remaining unflinching in the face of danger or discomfort. But this child, this tiny girl with wide eyes, filled with desperation, she was showing him a different side of the world, one he wasn't sure how to navigate. "What do you need me to do?" The words slipped out before he could stop them, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl blinked, then smiled faintly as though his question had confirmed something she had hoped for all along. Her voice was barely audible when she spoke again. "Help me find him. Help me find him. Help me make them listen. Please, sir. You're the only one who can." The prince's heart clenched, and for the first time in years he felt a surge of uncertainty. What was the right thing to do? He was a royal guard, bound by duty to remain at his post, to never stray, to never falter. But here he stood, questioning everything he had ever believed. Looking down at the girl in front of him, he knew one thing for sure. Whatever path lay ahead, it would change everything. For the first time, duty didn't feel like a shield. It felt like a cage. And the key to breaking free might just lie in the hands of this little girl, standing before him with nothing but hope in her eyes. Mike Edwards' mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. The note the little girl had given him still weighed heavily in his hand, its simple words echoing in his mind. "Please save him. He's the only family I have left." And yet, despite the urgency of her plea, despite the sincerity in her eyes, he couldn't shake the growing knot of doubt that twisted in his stomach. His mind raced, his duty, his oath to protect the royal family, to uphold the honor of the crown. They all clashed with the image of this tiny, vulnerable girl standing before him. He glanced down at her again. Her bare feet were now stained with the dirt of the castle grounds, and her once bright green pajamas were now wrinkled and torn, clearly a far cry from the fine clothing that royalty, and even the common folk, would expect to see in a place like Windsor Castle. She wasn't supposed to be here. No one who wasn't of royal blood, or at the very least of noble lineage, was ever supposed to step foot in these hallowed halls. But here she was, a child asking for his help, her only request simple: save her brother. Mike Edwards swallowed hard. Duty versus humanity. Those were the words that played over and over in his mind. He was trained to never falter, never question, never stray from the rigid expectations of his role. But this little girl, her eyes, her voice, they were pulling him in a direction he hadn't expected. He was supposed to protect the royal family. He had sworn an oath, time and time again, to keep the kingdom safe from harm, to uphold the monarchy's legacy. But what did it mean to protect? Was it only about keeping the walls of the castle intact, ensuring the royal bloodline remained unthreatened, or was there something more, something human, that he was overlooking? As he stood there, staring down at her, the weight of his duty seemed almost suffocating. He could feel the presence of his fellow guards in the distance, standing watch like statues, silent, unmoving. They had no such doubts. Their duty was clear: protect the castle, protect the monarchy. And yet here he was on the precipice of something that felt different. Something that might cost him his place in this world of order and tradition.
The little girl shifted uncomfortably on her feet, waiting for his response. Mike Edward glanced at her again, a deep ache in his chest as he thought about his own family. His mother, the queen, who had raised him with the expectation of perfection. His father, the king, who had always told him to stay strong, never show weakness, never question authority. But it hadn't always been this way. There was a time, many years ago, when his world wasn't so neatly confined by the walls of the palace. His thoughts drifted back to his childhood, to a simpler time when his family had lived in a small village before the weight of the crown had been thrust upon him. He remembered the village square, where children his own age had run and played without a care in the world. His mother would often take him to the market, where he'd watch the local vendors sell fresh bread, meats, and flowers. His father had worked long hours, but he would always find time to play a game with him, teaching him how to wield a sword, how to ride a horse, but also how to be kind to those around him. It was a time of innocence, when he believed in the good in people. But those days have been fleeting. The moment he was thrust into royal service, everything had changed. The lessons of humanity and kindness were replaced with a strict adherence to duty and formality. The guards around him were silent, their expressions unreadable, their lives as structured as his own. There was no room for personal choice, no room for deviation from the plan. You protect the kingdom, you protect the crown, and that is all you need to know. And yet, as he stood before this little girl, pleading for him to save her brother, he couldn't ignore the tug of something deeper, a need to protect that wasn't bound by crowns or titles. In that moment he was torn. A low voice interrupted his internal struggle, pulling him back to the present. "Your Highness." It was the familiar voice of one of his fellow guards, Officer Cates, a man who had served alongside him for years. Cates stood at attention, his face impassive, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. "Is everything all right, sir?" Cates's voice was calm, but the briefest flicker of curiosity flashed in his eyes. Mike Edward turned toward him, his mind still clouded, his thoughts still uncertain. I'm not sure," he replied quietly, his gaze flicking back to the little girl who was still waiting, hope in her eyes. Cates glanced between the prince and the girl, his brow furrowing slightly. "She's just a child," he said bluntly, his tone neutral. "Do you really think she belongs here? It's not our place to get involved in such matters." He gave a brief, almost imperceptible nod toward the girl, his posture stiff. "The royal family will take care of this, Your Highness. We don't need to step out of line." Mike Edward felt a sudden surge of frustration, a desire to defend the child standing before him. Does she deserve to be ignored because she doesn't have the right blood, he thought? Does she not matter because she doesn't wear the right clothing or speak the right words? His inner conflict was becoming unbearable. He could hear Cates's words echoing in his mind. "It's not our place." But something inside him, a deeper, more human instinct, was telling him otherwise. What kind of protector was he if he couldn't answer this call, if he couldn't act when someone truly needed him? The girl's small voice broke through his thoughts. "Please," she whispered, her hands still clutching the ragged teddy bear. Her plea, simple and filled with desperation, broke through the walls he had carefully built around himself. As Mike Edward looked at her again, he knew she wasn't just any child. She was a living, breathing reminder of all the things he had left behind. The compassion, the humanity, the desire to make a real difference, not just in the world of power and privilege, but in the lives of those who needed help the most. But as Kate stood beside him, unwavering, Mike Edwards' resolve began to falter. What if I'm wrong, he wondered. What if I'm risking everything for something that will only bring harm? The prince glanced back at Kate's, then down at the little girl. His mind swirled with 1,000 possible outcomes. What would happen if he helped her? Would it truly make a difference? Or would his actions cost him everything he had worked for? And still, the girl's hopeful eyes held his gaze, waiting for him to act. In that moment, everything he had been taught, every protocol, every piece of royal tradition seemed to fall away. Only one question remained. What kind of protector was he truly meant to be? Mike Edwards' mind felt like a storm, each thought crashing against the next. His body, trained for this moment, stood rigid as ever, his back straight, his hands clasped in front of him, but inside, the conflict churned. He glanced at Officer Cates, the stern, unblinking guard who had served loyally at the castle for years. Cates stood tall, as he always did, his face a mask of professionalism, though there was something in his eyes now that betrayed the slightest curiosity, perhaps even concern. The guard switched places with him, sending the lair onto Ingram's section of paling. The prince opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. What am I supposed to do? For years, his duty had been crystal clear: protect the royal family, the kingdom, the institution. Everything else was secondary. Every move, every action had been defined by this singular purpose. But now, standing before this small, pleading girl, every principle he had upheld seemed to blur. This wasn't about royalty, about titles or bloodlines. It was about compassion, about standing up for someone who had no one else. The girl stood silently before him, her eyes filled with quiet, unwavering trust. And in that silence, something inside the prince shifted. He didn't know why, he didn't know how, but at that moment, a decision was made. Not in the way he had been trained, not through the cold, rational lens of protocol, but through something deeper, something human. "Kate's Mike," Edward said, his voice suddenly firmer, more resolute than he felt. The guard's eyebrows furrowed slightly, and for a moment it seemed as though the weight of the prince's words had caught him off guard. "Your Highness," Kate's replied, his tone still neutral, but his eyes filled with an uncertainty that reflected the prince's own turmoil. "I need you to watch my post," Mike Edwards said, his words deliberate. "I'll be back shortly." For the first time in years, he stepped away from his designated position. He didn't wait for Kate's approval, nor did he seek confirmation from anyone else. He had already made his choice. His feet moved of their own accord, following the small girl who had asked for his help, his heart thundering in his chest as if he were breaking the very foundation of his identity. The castle, which had always been a place of stoic silence and rigid authority, now felt distant. The walls seemed to close in around him, not with the comfort of tradition, but with the weight of his own decision. And yet, despite the uncertainty gnawing at him, he couldn't stop himself from following her. The little girl didn't speak again as she walked ahead of him, her small frame darting between the stone columns and hidden alleyways, the hem of her pajamas brushing against the cold, ancient stone. The teddy bear she held in her arms swayed gently with each step she took, its faded fabric a poignant reminder of the simple, innocent childhood she had been robbed of. Mike Edward quickened his pace, not wanting to lose sight of her. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the soft echoes of their footsteps and the distant call of birds overhead. The world around them seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them, strangers in a place where the world was designed to keep them apart. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they came to a small, hidden courtyard near the edge of the castle grounds, a place he had never noticed before, tucked behind ivy-covered walls and a rusting iron gate. The air here was heavy with the scent of damp earth and the sound of a distant brook babbling quietly in the background. The little girl paused, turning to face him. Mike Edward stopped beside her, unsure of what to say. He had crossed a line, abandoned his duty, and yet it didn't feel wrong. It felt necessary. "What are you helping me?" the girl asked, her voice small but tinged with something that could have been fear or disbelief. Her wide eyes searched his face, as though she were trying to understand why a royal prince, so far removed from her world, had decided to come with her. The question hit him harder than he expected. He could have easily dismissed her, returned to his post, and let someone else deal with the problem. But something about her had captured him, something about the way she looked at him with such vulnerability and trust. He took a deep breath, trying to steady the unexpected swell of emotion rising within him. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice softer than he intended. "Maybe because you needed someone. Maybe because I understand what it feels like to be lost." The words came out before he could stop them, a truth he had buried deep inside for years. There had been times in his own life, back when he was a boy, when he had felt small and helpless, when the cold, formal walls of the castle had seemed more like a prison than a sanctuary. His parents, the queen and king, had never been cruel, but they had always been distant, wrapped up in the expectations of the throne, leaving him to navigate the world on his own. He had grown up with a sense of loneliness, always striving to live up to their expectations, but never quite feeling like he belonged. He had learned to suppress those feelings, to bury them deep beneath the surface, but now, in this moment, in the presence of this little girl, They resurfaced with an intensity that startled him. The girl seemed to study him for a long moment, her eyes searching, as if trying to understand what he had just said. Finally, she spoke again, her voice trembling with emotion. "I was scared," she whispered. "I didn't know who else to ask. Everyone else just ignored me. But you look like someone who could help." Mike Edwards' heart tightened at her words. It was a simple statement, yet it carried so much weight. She had been ignored. She had been abandoned. And now she was standing before him, asking for the one thing he had never truly been able to give himself: compassion. "You're not alone anymore," he said quietly, his voice filled with a determination he hadn't known he possessed. "I'll help you, I promise, whatever it takes." Her face brightened, and for the first time since he had met her, she smiled. It was a small smile, but it was enough to make the prince's chest swell with an unexpected warmth. He didn't know how he would help her, or what exactly lay ahead, but in that moment he knew that he had made the right decision. His heart felt lighter, the weight of duty and tradition suddenly less important than the promise he had just made. "Thank you," she whispered, the relief in her voice palpable. "Thank you, Mike Edward." The sound of his name coming from her lips sent a jolt through him. He wasn't sure why it felt so strange, so foreign, but as he stood there, watching the girl's eyes fill with hope, he knew one thing for certain. This moment, this decision, was the beginning of something entirely new, something beyond the walls of the castle, beyond the royal bloodline. It was the start of a journey, not just to protect, but to truly serve. "Let's go," he said, his voice steady now, with a newfound resolve. "We have work to do." And with that, the prince stepped forward, ready to face whatever lay ahead. He had chosen to follow his heart, and in doing so he had discovered something far more valuable than his royal duty: the power of compassion and the true meaning of being a protector. The heavy iron gates of the castle clanged shut behind them, the sound echoing through the stone courtyard as Mike Edward and the little girl moved quickly through the narrow alleyways of Windsor. The prince could feel the weight of his actions settling on his shoulders, but it didn't feel like a burden. Instead, it felt like a release, a lightness he hadn't known in years. He had stepped away from everything he had been taught to value: his rigid sense of duty, his unyielding position as a royal guard. And in that moment, following this small child through the castle grounds, he knew he had made the right choice. The little girl, now a few steps ahead, walked with a sense of newfound purpose, her small feet brushing against the cobblestones. Her posture was no longer hunched from the fear that had once gripped her. There was an almost invisible spring in her step. She wasn't running, but she was no longer walking in hesitation. She was walking towards something that mattered to her, something that required more than just courage. It required a protector. And for the first time, Mike Edward understood what it meant to be that protector. "Do you know where we're going?" The prince's voice broke the silence, and the girl glanced up at him, her eyes wide but steady. "It exactly," she admitted, "but I think we're close." They continued moving, their steps quickening, until they arrived at an unassuming wooden door set against the back wall of the castle's outer courtyard. The prince had never noticed it before. He had spent years walking these grounds, patrolling its walls, guarding its gates, but never had he seen this entrance. The hidden nature of the place seemed to fit the girl perfectly, as though she had always belonged here, out of sight but never truly forgotten. She paused at the door and knocked twice. Soft, deliberate knocks. There was a long pause before the door creaked open, revealing a tall man with tired eyes, his clothes worn but clean. He gave the girl a quick look, then his gaze shifted to Mike Edward, who was standing just behind her, his stance still stiff and formal despite the weight of the moment. "Is this the one?" the man asked, his voice low, as though speaking louder might draw unwanted attention. The girl nodded, clutching her teddy bear tightly. "This is Mike Edward. He's come to help." The man studied the prince for a long moment, his brow furrowed in silent scrutiny. But then, with a slight nod, he stepped aside to let them in. As they entered, Mike Edward found himself in what appeared to be a modest living space, far removed from the grandeur of the palace. The walls were lined with shelves of old books and trinkets, many of which seemed worn from years of use. The smell of herbs and something sweet lingered in the air, the dim light from a single candle flickering softly in the corner. "I'm sorry to bring you here," the girl said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but this is the only place I knew where I could get help." The man who had opened the door, who had remained silent up until this point, finally spoke again. "What do you need then? The prince doesn't have time to play savior to every lost child in the kingdom." Mike Edward looked at the man, his patience fraying. "I am not here to save anyone," he said quietly. "I'm here because I made a promise." The words seemed to hang in the air, and the man gave a quick, thoughtful glance before nodding slowly. "A promise. Fair enough. Ha." The prince turned back to the little girl, his curiosity piqued. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice softer now. "Why did you come to me? What is it that you need help with?" The girl's eyes flickered toward the man, who gave a slight nod, as though granting permission. She took a deep breath and began speaking, her voice tremulous but determined. "My name's Tamsin," she started, her eyes downcast. "My brother Marcus is in trouble. He's been taken by the people who run the orphanage where I lived, but I don't know why. All I know is that they've been hurting him. They made him take the blame for things he didn't do, and now they've locked him up. They said they were going to send him away. They said I couldn't come with him." She paused, swallowing hard. "They didn't care about us. They never cared." Tamsin's hands shook as she tightened her grip on the worn teddy bear. Mike Edward felt the weight of her words settle in his chest, a cold, heavy weight that he couldn't shake. This wasn't just a child in need of help. This was a child whose life had been shaped by pain, by neglect, and now the system that was supposed to protect her was failing her in the most profound way possible. Mike Edward bent down so that he was eye level with Tamsin, his face softening. "You're not alone anymore," he said, the words carrying a weight that came from deep within him. He didn't know what he could do, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. "I'll find your brother, I promise." She looked at him with something that resembled hope, her eyes still uncertain, but there was a flicker of trust in them that hadn't been there before. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Tamsin's story had struck a chord deep within him. The prince had always believed that duty was about protecting the kingdom, about ensuring the safety of the monarchy. But now, standing in this small, humble room, surrounded by the remnants of Tamsin's broken world, he understood that real duty went beyond what he had been taught. It was not just about protecting titles, it was about protecting people, the ones who had no one else. His resolve hardened. He stood, feeling a shift in his purpose, a sense of clarity that he had never experienced before. "We'll go to the orphanage tomorrow," he said. "We'll find Marcus and bring him back." The man who had opened the door nodded again, this time more sincerely. "Good," he said. "We could use the help." As the prince turned toward Tamsin, he felt something stir inside him, something both painful and freeing. The walls that had defined his life, the rules and the royal protocols, seemed insignificant now. What mattered was what was right. What mattered was what he could do to make things right. "I know I'm not the hero you might have been expecting," Mike Edwards said, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "But I will do everything I can to bring your brother back." Tamsin's eyes shone with unshed tears, but this time the tears were not of fear, they were of relief. She nodded slowly, as though she finally believed that there was someone who would listen, someone who would fight for her. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the courtyard. The light seemed to fade from the world around them, but inside the small room, a new sense of hope had begun to bloom. The prince knew that, whatever happened next, He was no longer bound by the walls of the royal castle, nor by the crown that had once defined him. He was something more now. He was a protector, not just of royalty, but of those who had no one else to turn to. And in that moment, the prince understood. This was where his true duty lay. "Let's go," he said, standing tall once again, the weight of his new purpose settling comfortably within him. "Tomorrow, we'll start bringing justice to the ones who need it the most." And together, they stepped forward into a future neither of them had imagined, one that would change their lives forever. The night had settled quietly over Windsor Castle, the soft whisper of the evening wind the only sound breaking the silence. Mike Edwards stood by a narrow window, looking out over the courtyard, where the dim glow of the lanterns cast long shadows across the stone. His fingers gripped the cold stone sill, the weight of the events that had unfolded over the past few days pressing heavily on him. He felt different, in ways he couldn't fully explain, but he knew that the man who had looked out over these very grounds just a week ago was not the same as the one standing here now. He had followed a child's plea. He had stepped away from his post, defied the rigid expectations of duty that had governed his life for so long, and in doing so, he had unlocked something deeper inside of him, something he had long forgotten, or perhaps never fully known: compassion, a sense of responsibility that transcended titles, boundaries, and even the walls of the royal palace. Tamsin's story had changed him. It had shown him the painful truth that for all his years of service to the crown, for all the medals and honors that adorned his uniform, he had never truly served anyone but himself. His life had been an endless cycle of rules and protocol, upholding a kingdom that he had come to realize was not the whole world. There were people out there, real people, whose lives were defined by struggle, by injustice, and by pain, and for the first time he understood that his true role, his true calling, was not just as a guard to royalty, but as a protector of those who had no one else. The sound of footsteps broke through his thoughts, and he turned to see Tamsin standing in the doorway. She was still wearing the same faded green pajamas, but her face was different now. The wariness had faded, replaced by a quiet hope that made her look years older than she had when they first met. Her teddy bear was fought firmly under her arm, a reminder of the innocence she had fought to preserve, in a world that had tried to take it from her. Mike Edwards smiled softly, gesturing for her to come in. She hesitated for a moment before walking toward him, her steps tentative but purposeful. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently. "I'm okay," Tamsin said, her voice steady, though there was a hint of vulnerability still lingering. "I know we have a lot of work to do, but I feel safe now. I feel like there's a chance." Mike Edwards' heart swelled with something that felt like pride, but also something deeper, something that resonated with a sense of purpose that had been dormant for far too long. He had given her a promise. He had given her hope, and now he had to keep that promise. "I'll make sure nothing happens to you," he said firmly, stepping closer to her, "and I'll do whatever it takes to get your brother back." Tamsin nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I believe you," she whispered, her voice full of quiet gratitude. He looked at her for a long moment, watching as she clutched the bear a little tighter, as though the comfort of that simple, worn-out toy was enough to steady her in this world that had shown her so much cruelty. "I know you've been through a lot," Mike Edward continued, his tone soft but resolute, "and I know it's not over yet, but I promise we'll make things right. We'll bring justice." Tamsin's gaze shifted toward the window, where the lights of the castle flickered in the distance, and the stars above seemed to burn a little brighter. "I know. I can feel it now. Things are changing." The prince stood beside her, his own eyes drifting toward the stars. He had never been one to believe in fate, in destiny. But standing here, in this small room, with this small child, he felt something shift inside him. He had stepped away from the life that had been planned for him, the life of a royal guard and the protector of tradition. And in doing so, he had found a new path, a path that for the first time felt true to who he was meant to be. Perhaps this was his true calling after all, not in the armor of a guard, but in the quiet, often unheralded service of others, not in protecting a bloodline, but in protecting the vulnerable, the forgotten. Tamsin broke the silence, her voice filled with quiet wonder. You don't have to stay a guard, you know. You could be more. You could help people like us, really help them. The words hit him harder than he expected. He could see it, almost like a vision. The world beyond the castle walls, the kingdom he had sworn to protect, but this time with a different purpose. The path she suggested, the one she was encouraging him to follow, was one of service, not just to the crown but to the people who lived within its borders. Mike Edward turned to her, a small smile tugging at his lips. I'm not sure where this will lead, he said thoughtfully, but I do know one thing. I'm not going back to the life I had before. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I'm going to make it count. For you, for your brother, and for anyone else who needs help. Tamsin smiled back, her eyes wide with a hope that seemed to radiate from her very being. Then we'll do it together, right? Mike Edward felt a surge of something that felt like a promise, not just to her but to himself. Yes, together. The silence that followed was no longer heavy or filled with uncertainty. Instead, it was the kind of silence that came with understanding, a shared sense of purpose. And as the prince stood by the window, looking out at the vast expanse of the kingdom he had sworn to protect, he realized that he had found his new path, not as a royal guard but as a protector of something far more important than titles and tradition. Tamsin was right. The future wasn't just about defending the walls of the castle. It was about defending the people, standing up for the vulnerable, and fighting for what was right, even when the world made it difficult. Together they would change the course of their futures. The princess and the prince, both lost in their own ways, but now bound by a promise that would carry them forward toward a new purpose, toward a new life. And in that quiet, they both knew, whatever lay ahead, they would face it together.